This is nonsense. This is Zionist propaganda.
If you were in their position right now, you're born into the Palestinian territories in Gaza, and you are raised through all of this, where you have Hamas controlling this dictatorship, sort of Islamic, like you said, organization, plus you have what Israel is doing to you as well. Would you be in the mindset of, okay, I also want to join Hamas?
I probably would. Certainly, I would feel the urge to resist the Israeli invader and killer of my family. From 1967 on, the Israeli colonial enterprise in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip was a settler colonial enterprise. It settled Israelis and Jews inside territory which was initially all Arab.
Benny Morris is one of Israel's most well-known and controversial historians. He was a professor of history in the Middle East Studies Department at Ben-Gurion University. He's also written several books on the conflict, on the Israel-Palestine conflict, all of which are very popular and widely quoted in academic texts. Thanks so much for joining, Benny. I want to start off.
My pleasure, and I think I wrote about 9 books on the conflict.
That's quite a lot. So I want to start off by just asking you about these common talking points that pro-Israel people constantly use, and get your thoughts on it, if they're true, false, or otherwise. Is that okay? Okay, so yeah. I've got 9 of them. There's much more, but I've got 9. So the first one is, people say Israel can't make a peace deal with enemies who want to destroy them, such as Hamas. Is that what do you think of that?
Well, peace deals are always made between enemies, after wars, before wars, during wars. Hamas, unfortunately, has an ideology and doctrine which calls for Israel's destruction. I doubt if peace talks with the Hamas, if they were ever engaged, would lead to a peace agreement. But Israel must definitely talk to the Palestinians, not the Hamas, which at the moment seems to represent them. But there are also more moderate voices among the Palestinians, and we should definitely be talking to them, as we did in the 90s, as we did in 2000. Unfortunately, they at the time rejected the peace deals on offer, but hopefully new Palestinians will emerge who will be more conciliatory.
You said the whole point of a peace deal is with enemies, so why doesn't that apply to Hamas?
Well, Hamas is an enemy who avows, firstly, it's an enemy which is Islamist, in other words, doctrinaire, religious, absolute values. And one of its absolute values is the destruction of Israel and its replacement by a Palestinian Arab state, theocratic, religious, etc. I don't think that they will make peace with Israel. I may be wrong, but I don't think they will. As one perhaps might have expected of Hitler in the 1930s, he wouldn't actually make peace. He would sign documents and supposed agreements, but he didn't actually make peace with the Western democracies. And in the end, he attacked them and they had to destroy him. This might be the case with Hamas.
So just to be clear, you're saying that the whole point of peace deals is with enemies, but Hamas is too far. You should be able to do with more moderate voices within the Palestinians who are still technically enemies of Israel.
Yes, I think that's the situation. There are Palestinians, they are the enemy, but there are more moderate and less moderate Palestinians. Absolutist enemies such as the Hamas, I don't believe will make peace. That's their religious belief. They must destroy the Jewish state. This is what Allah commanded them to do. And I don't see them making peace. They have occasionally hinted that they're willing to make a truce, a 5-year truce, a 1-year truce, what they call a hudna with Israel, but they have never, of course, said they would entertain the idea of actually peacemaking with Israel and a 2-state solution, Israel alongside a independent Palestine.
So let's talk about the more moderate voices then. So another point that people say is that the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas, who leads the Palestinian Authority, uses moderate language in public, but really behind the scenes, they're just as radical as Hamas with their pay-to-slay law. What do you think of that?
Well, I think there are different people in the Palestinian Authority. I think in their hearts, most Palestinians, probably including most officials in the Palestinian Authority or the Palestine National Authority, as it's called, most of them would like to see Israel disappear. Some of them, I think, understand Israel is not going to disappear anytime soon, and they must make peace with it, some of them. And it could be that Hamas is among them. Abbas is among them. Abbas also says he wants to make peace with Israel on the basis of a two-state solution. I don't know if he's being sincere. I don't know if he wants to establish a Palestinian state alongside Israel in the hope that it will be a springboard to further assault on Israel once it's established. I don't know. But as I say, probably in the Palestinian Authority, among the Palestinians, there are people who understand that Israel is not going to go away, that they must make peace with Israel if they want to live in peace as well.
Because what I'm trying to work out is, like you said, Israel can make peace deals, but just not with Hamas. So I'm wondering, can they make peace deals with the PA?
Probably. How sincere the PA will be once it signs such a deal and establishes a state of its own alongside Israel, I don't know. This time will tell, but I think Israel must give the thing a shot. It must try it, because just living in constant warfare with our neighbors is no solution to anything.
Amazing. Okay, so we'll go to the third common pro-Israel talking point, which is that Palestinians mainly fled their home during the 1948 war because the Arab leaders told them to run away so that the Arab countries could more easily attack Israel. What do you think of that?
This is nonsense. This is Zionist propaganda, first propagated, in fact, in the course of the 48 war. Most Arabs who fled, and some 700,000 out of 1.2 or 1.3 million Arabs who lived in Palestine, now called Palestinians, 700,000 of them were evacuated their homes, fled their homes, mostly as a result of the war reaching their doorstep or about to reach their doorstep. A small number of them were expelled by Israel, physically expelled, and a small number also left as a result of instructions or advice by their own leaders or by Arabs from outside Palestine, but mostly by their own leaders. Those are more or less the proportions. They certainly did not leave en masse, as Israeli propaganda said at the time, as a result of instruction or orders or invitations by Arab leaders to leave their homes, as they did not leave also as a result mainly of expulsion by Israeli troops.
So where did it come from? How did it already arise within the war that the only reason they're leaving is to let the Arab states come in and invade?
Oh no, this was maybe some Zionist leaders believed that was the case in the course of the 48 war, but certainly it was promulgated partly as a result of what happened in Haifa in April 1948 by the Zionist leaders, who said it was the Arab leaders who told them to leave. In Haifa, in late April 1948, the local leadership more or less told the Arabs who remained in Haifa to leave because the Zionists were winning and about to take over Haifa. And the Arab states would soon go to war against Israel, and it was best that they the Arabs leave that town, a potential future war zone, and not be hurt by the oncoming Arab armies or by the Zionists. This did happen in Haifa, but this is a small proportion of the Palestine Arabs. Many of Haifa's residents left before the local leadership announced that they should leave, which happened on the 22nd of April, and many of them left with no connection to what their local leaders said. They simply feared Israeli war-making, feared life under Israel should they come under Israeli rule, and they left.
So
but as relates to the rest of Palestine, this simply wasn't the case. There were some leaders in villages in certain areas who instructed all the villagers to leave, or at least the women and children to leave their homes. But this only occurred in a small proportion of Palestine's villages and towns.
So this just grew. The people in Israel just started spreading this after the war, and it just grew and grew and grew until everyone more or less believes that's what happened. That was the Arab.
I don't know if everyone more or less believed this. Many Israelis came to believe this because this was the official Zionist line, that the Arab leaders had asked the Arabs to leave, and that's why they fled, and that was why there was a Palestine refugee problem. But this is not historically true.
Okay, so let's go on to the fourth common pro-Israel talking point, which is that Palestine as a country has never existed. What do you think?
This is not a talking point. This is true. Palestine has never been a state. Palestine has been an area so designated by the Romans after they crushed the first and second Jewish revolts in the first and second centuries AD. Palestine, under Arab rule from the 7th century until the Middle Ages, was divided into a number of provinces. During the Middle Ages, it was conquered by Christians called Crusaders. Afterwards, various Muslim entities conquered Palestine, but they never designated Palestine as a separate, even administrative zone. It was only part of Syria, or it was part of Lebanon. It was never a separate zone. So it was never a state at any point, and it wasn't even a separate, distinct province for most of the period of Islamic rule of the country.
What about from during the Britain's mandate of it?
In the British conquered Palestine from the Turks in 1917, 1918, and they instituted what they called a mandate, given permission to do so by the League of Nations. And from that point on, the whole area from the river to the sea, what is more or less historic Palestine, became the British-ruled area of Mandate Palestine. At that time, it was one designated distinct area.
Oh, but you wouldn't call it a country at that point? During the mandate?
The question is, the area was called Palestine from Roman days, then by the Christians, as an area, not as a distinct state or administrative zone. It became a distinct administrative zone under the British, during the British Mandate from 1917-18 until 1948. But before then and after then, there was no Palestine Arab state, there was no Palestinian state, and there was no, almost throughout this 2,000 years since the Romans, there was no distinct provincial administrative entity called Palestine.
Okay, so we'll go into the next point. Like I said, it's up to you to tell me if they're true or false. And the next point is that Palestinians as an ethnic group has never existed, and they only started to exist when the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was founded by the Arab states in 1964.
This isn't really true either. It's true that the people who lived in Palestine, were they Muslims and Christians, Arabs, or Druze, or even Jews, and there was a small number of Jews living there, none of them called themselves Palestinians. The Arabs in Palestine, the Christian ones and the majority Muslim ones, regarded themselves as Arabs. They regarded themselves as Muslims, thought of themselves basically as residents of a certain area in the country, Haifa, Jaffa, whatever, as Jaffaites and Haifaites, but not as Palestinians. That wasn't the term used. During the British Mandate, 1917, 18, 1948, the people who lived in the area of the British Mandate territory of Palestine were Palestinians and were issued Palestinian identity cards, but these were British Mandate identity cards, and this referred to Arabs and Jews. Both the Jews and the Arabs who lived in the country were regarded as residents of British-ruled Palestine. The term Palestinian in reference to Arabs of Palestine who lived here only began to come into some form of existence in the 1920s, when the Arabs of Palestine began to see themselves as separate from, at least in terms of a potential political trajectory, separate from the Arabs of Syria or the Arabs of Jordan or the Arabs of Lebanon. Regarding Lebanon and Syria, which came under French rule, their destiny would be governed by their relationship with France. The Arabs in Palestine from 1920 on began to think as their destiny in relation to what would happen with the Zionists and with the British who ruled Palestine. And from that point on, some of them began to think of themselves as distinct from their Syrian and other neighbors as Palestinian Arabs. But the term Palestinian only came into common use after 1948 as a description of the Arabs who had lived in Palestine or still lived in Palestine. That term Palestinian Arabs only came into real existence post 1948. In fact, post their dispersion in large numbers from Palestine.
So just to be clear, they started almost like forming together during the mandatory period, and after 48, it started to become common usage.
Yes.
And what do you call them? At what point did they become an ethnic group, or it doesn't really make a difference? Or I don't know, like what would you say about that? Was there any specific point they became an ethnic group, or they just are an ethnic group?
I don't know how to answer that. As I said, they were Arabs. They were mainly, their identity was Arabs and Muslim, and as I say, residents of a certain locality in the area, which the Christians and they themselves sometimes called Palestine. Were they separate ethnic groups? Well, they spoke the same language. They prayed to the same God as the Arabs in Syria, the Arabs in Lebanon, or some of the Arabs in Lebanon, and the Arabs in Jordan. A separate ethnic group, I suppose, the moment a group of people, a large group of people, consider themselves distinct from, different from their neighbors, they are recognized usually as a separate people, and therefore have a separate identity. That's the norm. And as I say, among Arabs in Palestine, this became certainly true growingly from the 1920s, predominantly true from the 1930s, 1940s, or post 1948.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense.
I don't know if that answers your question. I don't know if it answers your question, but that's I think the best way of describing it.
Well, no, I'll tell you why I'm asking it, because when I've spoken to some people, they said, well, Israel can't be. There's no chance. There's not even a possibility that Israel's doing an ethnic cleansing, regardless of what actually happening in Gaza, is because there's no such thing as Palestinians as an ethnic groups. They can't be targeting anyone.
No, this is nonsense. If the Israelis want to and were actually trying to commit ethnic cleansing, and they were kicking out the Arabs from Gaza or from the West Bank, this would be ethnic cleansing. Obviously, it doesn't matter what the wording is. You know how people define Palestinians or not. This would be ethnic cleansing. The real question with regard to the Gaza Strip and perhaps with the West Bank is ethnic cleansing Israeli policy, and is it being implemented in Gaza and in the West Bank? And this is a complex question with complex answers.
Yeah, hopefully we'll get into it a bit nearer to the end. So we'll go on to the sixth point, which is that when pro-Palestinian supporters are being interviewed on radio or TV, the most common question they're asked is, do you support Israel's right to exist? But I want to ask you, what does it mean for a country to have a right to exist?
Well, Israel is unique in the world, I think, more or less at least, in its existence being questioned. It's unique in this sense that some people, many people perhaps, certainly many Arabs, believe that it has no right to exist. And growingly, unfortunately, among some of the publics in the West, this too is being adopted as a stance, a political position. Nobody asks this about France or Germany or Italy or perhaps even San Marino or Andorra. Do they have a right to exist? Everybody takes it for granted they have a right to exist. Certainly, members of the United Nations, nobody questions their right to exist. There is a question about Israel in this respect, and this is unusual. I don't know how to answer it. I think countries have a right to exist if they exist. I don't think countries should be destroyed. Russia may be at the moment trying to destroy Ukraine, but this isn't seen as legitimate. Russia's aim, if that is its aim, it isn't seen as legitimate by the world international community, maybe except for North Korea. And most countries still at the moment don't question Israel's right to exist. Though, as I say, there are growing publics, certainly in the Arab world, who do question Israel's right to exist.
Because I think it was UN Special Report of the Palestinian Territories, Francesca Albanese, being asked this question, and she said in a response, what does it mean, do I have the right to exist? I mean, Israel exists. The question is, how does it exist? Does it exist as a Jewish state? Does it exist? That's the bigger question, rather, does it have a right to exist? Because like you said, every country just exists.
No, that she's being too subtle. The question really is whether Israel as a Jewish state has the right to exist. That's really the question. whether it has a right to exist, and then the name would of course change, as a Arab majority state, as an Arab majority democratic state, that's a different question. But the question really is, does Israel have the right to exist as a Jewish state presently between the river and the sea, or in large parts of the area between the river and the sea? That's the question.
Yeah. Okay. So the seventh point that I want to go through is people often say that it's anti-Semitic to be against the Jewish state of Israel, to be anti-Zionist. What do you make of that?
There is a problem here. There is an overlap between being anti-Israeli and being anti-Semitic. There's an obvious overlap. The overlap is that most anti-Semites, people who for some reason hate Jews, would also like Israel not to exist. That's a big overlap. There are among those who are anti-Israeli, don't like Israel's behavior or don't want it to exist. There are among them those who are also anti-Semites. But not all anti-Zionists are anti-Semites. There are people who don't like the state of Israel, or object to the way it's behaving or has behaved in the past. And they are not anti-Semites. They don't dislike Jews or hate Jews. But as I say, there is an overlap between the two.
Because the definition by anti-Zionists here isn't like against Israeli policy, but against the existence of Israel as a Jewish state.
Okay, no, you can be both. You can be either or both. You can be against the Israeli government's policies in the territories or elsewhere. You can be against Israel's existence, or you can be both. It's not anti-Semitic. There are good reasons. I would say there are good reasons, reasonable reasons for people to dislike the existence of the Jewish state. It has been in some way at the expense of the local Arab population, the establishment and existence of the state of Israel. Some people think the whole enterprise, the Zionist enterprise, has been impractical. It's not something which will last, and therefore it shouldn't have begun. As I say, some also have a moral reason for repudiating Zionism, because, as I say, it in some way has been at the expense of the local Arab population. But there are also people who, as I say, oppose Israel's existence for anti-Semitic reasons.
Okay, no, that makes sense. Okay, so the eighth point is that people often say that the media
Sure. Okay, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so the eighth point is that people often say that the media is biased against Israel because they focus so much on Israel, whilst there's other things happening in Sudan and other areas of the world, which is also really bad. And therefore it's anti-Semitic, or it's biased against Israel. What would you say to that?
Well, not necessarily anti-Semitic, but there is a tendency in the world press, and I recently wrote yesterday, in fact, today I posted it, about the Irish press, the press in Ireland, where you will find in a major Irish newspaper on a given day 4 or 5 articles about the Gaza Strip and starvation in the Gaza Strip, or Israeli policy vis-a-vis the Gaza Strip, and so on. 5 articles in one day in a major newspaper, which doesn't devote an inch of space to what is happening in Sudan, where there's a civil war with hundreds of thousands of people apparently being killed or displaced or whatever. And there's a war in Ukraine, to which also at most the newspaper will devote 1 article a day or 1 article a week to what is happening in Ukraine, which has been assaulted by Russia. Israel and Gaza, the Gaza war in the last year and a half, have been given far more space than any of the crises enveloping the world or enveloping countries in the world over the past 2 years, in some of which many more people have been slaughtered, as in Syria or Sudan. So there seems to be an obsession with Israel. The obsession, incidentally, didn't begin, of course, with the Gaza war. This has been going on for decades. And it's to do with the Israel sitting on what is called for the Christians the Holy Land, and for Muslims a sacred piece of territory called Palestine. That is one reason for the obsession with Israel. Another seems to be that there is anti-Semitism rampant in both the Christian and the Muslim worlds, and therefore a focus on Jews and what they're doing in Israel or elsewhere is exaggerated, I would say. But there is definitely in the Western media, some of which I follow, there is an obsessive focus on Israel and its behavior.
Why is that? Is it because, it's, like you said, it's such a holy place to so many, and it's so important to so many?
Yeah, it's partly to do with that. It's partly to do in the West also with the Bible and the New Testament and Jesus's existence and preachings in the Holy Land. This is where the monotheistic religions in some way emerged. That's one reason. Another, as I said, is probably anti-Semitism. There is also a good economic reason, which is to do with the West's relationship with the Arab world and its economic reliance on the Arab world and the growing power of Arab money, the Arab economies as a result of their storehouses of oil. This and their interest, of course, in Palestine is in a sense natural, because they regard the Arab states and peoples regard the Arabs of Palestine as their brothers, even if they don't do too much for them, haven't done too much for them over the decades. But they have also a sense of brotherhood with the Palestinian Arabs, because they're fellow Muslims and Arabs. And this leads to some form of obsessiveness, which, as I say, has also affected the Western countries, which have to take account of what is said and done and believed in the Arab world in general.
Okay, so the ninth point is that Hamas is at fault for, the majority or many of the civilian deaths in Gaza for using human shields, because they place themselves near or next to or even underneath mosques, religious sites, schools, residential areas, etc. What would you think of that, and what do you think about the counter-response to that, which is that it's such a small space in Gaza that they just don't have much of a choice?
Both things you're saying are probably true. The Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, the two Islamist terrorist organizations who control the Gaza Strip before October 7th, 2023, built their fortifications, their underground tunnels, their rocket storage sites, etc., in public spaces, in the hope that Israel would not attack them there. Public spaces being mosques or under mosques, school buildings, universities, UNRWA sites. They used all of these to great benefit. During the war itself, the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad fighters hid often in tunnels underneath public buildings such as hospitals and mosques, or among refugees who also resettled, if you like, in these public spaces such as schools. And for Israel to get at them, Israel had to attack these public spaces, killing Hamasniks, but also killing the people among whom they were located. In short, the Hamas made use of this as a human civilian shield very successfully, partly as succeeding in hiding among them, knowing that Israel wouldn't attack them, or hiding among them and knowing that Israel would attack them, killing civilians, which could be translated into international uproar against Israel for killing civilians. This has been going on for the last 2 years in the Gaza Strip. The Hamas, incidentally, and the Islamic Jihad used the second human shield, which was, of course, the hostages these organizations took from Israel, mostly civilians, 251 of them, during their attack on Israel on the 7th of October. They took them back to the Gaza Strip and relied on their presence, the hostages' presence among them, to protect them from Israeli airstrikes or Israeli ground attack. And this has been true too. So the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, incidentally, which prevented all Arab civilians from entering the tunnel network, this was reserved only for their fighters. They used this as a policy, and it's been very successful for them.
So just to be clear, so Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which I presume you're referring to Palestinian Islamic Jihad?
Yeah, okay. Of course. Yeah.
So Hamas and PIJ, they take in the hostages and they place them and they use them as human shields, and they also place themselves within like schools and other places which act as human shields for them anyway. But would you say? But what about the point about that there's just not much space in Gaza? Do you think that has any validity?
Yeah, it's also true. Look, almost anywhere the Hamas would site a rocket launcher would be near a civilian residential or public area. The place is so small that if they wanted to site storage sites and rocket launchers anywhere, it would have to be, or would often be, next to civilian habitation or civilian public buildings. And this is true. If you're saying that, well, they argue that there's nowhere else to place all these things, and it's probably partly true.
Okay, so let's move on to what is Zionism as a concept. So, how do you describe Zionism? Would you say it's only a national liberation project? Would you say it's somewhat a colonial project, helped, only made possible by an imperial power? Or I don't know. What would you describe it as?
Here we're going into a big issue. Is Israel a settler, or Zionism a settler colonial project, or is it, as you say, a national liberation movement? Well, from the origin, it was a national liberation project, a project which would try to get Jews away from the claws of anti-Semitic violence in Eastern Europe and reestablish a Jewish state in the ancient Jewish homeland of Judea, which is today called Israel, the area of today called also Palestine. They wanted to reestablish a state there to be free of attack from anti-Semites in Europe. And this is what Zionists did, and this was their aim. They came and settled in a land which already had civilian inhabitants who were Arabs. It wasn't crowded, but there were, at the beginning of Zionism, close to 500,000 Arabs living in the area we define as Palestine, alongside some 25,000 Jews. Gradually, more and more Jews arrived, as I say, as a result of persecution and ideology, and arrived in Palestine in order to establish a state there. And this, while purchasing the land from very willing Arab sellers, they eventually began to push Arab neighbors aside, either through purchase of land and then demanding to be able to settle on that land and cultivate it, etc. From 1948, Israel also captured areas inhabited by Arabs and settled there. And again, the same thing has happened since 1967. Israel occupying a territory, planting Jewish settlements there, and gradually pushing back Arab habitation on their fringes, gradually expanding more and more the settler area, the area of settlement of Jews. This has happened in the West Bank and growingly in the last few years. From the beginning, I would define the Zionist enterprise as a national liberation movement and not a colonial enterprise, because settler colonial enterprises were masterminded by imperial powers like Britain and France in Algeria, Britain in America, or other places, in which they sent their sons. The empire sent its sons to settle in a certain place to establish their sovereignty, the imperial sovereignty in that area, and to exploit the natives and the resources in those territories. Zionism did not intend to exploit the resources of Palestine, because there are no natural resources in Palestine, and also more or less shunned from exploiting the local natives. In fact, the Zionist settlers for decades wanted a separate economy from the Arabs. They didn't want to use Arab labor, and they didn't want to be dependent on Arab labor or on Arab produce. They wanted to run themselves autonomously. And this is what they did basically until 1948. So in that sense, it wasn't an imperial settler colonial project. They weren't sent there by the British Empire. They weren't sent there by the Russian Empire or the French Empire. But it is true that from 1917 on, the British Empire, which conquered Palestine, was friendly, at least until 1937-38, was friendly to the Zionist enterprise and helped it. And the Jews were happy to receive this help. But they weren't agents of the British. And as it turned out, the British turned against Zionism, and the Zionists turned turned eventually against the British and even rebelled against them in 1944, 45, 47. So it wasn't an agent. Zionism and the Zionists were not agents of the British, were helped by the British for some of the period until, as I say, 1937, but weren't agents of the British and weren't serving British purposes. They were serving Zionist Jewish purposes, and that's the key thing here. After 1948, let me just continue this if we're talking about this. After 1948, Israel eventually aligned in some way with France, receiving armaments from France and political cover from France. And after 1960-something, aligned with America, the United States, and received armaments and political cover from America. In that sense, we had imperial allies. But we weren't agents of these imperial allies in the 50s and 60s and 70s and so on. We were just partners or allies of these imperial powers. So in that sense, you can't say that Zionism was an imperial agent. What you can say, and this is important to stress, from 1967 on, the Israeli colonial enterprise in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip was a settler colonial enterprise. It settled Israelis and Jews inside territory which was initially all Arab, as I say, also gradually pushed back Arabs and took over more and more territory from their Arab neighbors in these territories. In that sense, the Zionist enterprise became a settler colonial enterprise, but only after 67 and pertaining to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
Okay, so looking at it before, you said you're looking at what are the benefits. What are the Zionists trying to do by creating a state? Were they trying to exploit the people there in Palestine? So I want to ask from the other perspective, from the perspective of the British, who, like you said, were very friendly towards the Zionist venture for the first 20 years or so, if not around 20 years or so. Why were they friendly towards the Zionists? Was there any benefit for them as such a power? Did they want to control, let's say, the Suez Canal, or was that too far away to have any difference? Why were they trying to do this?
Okay, the British in the course of World War I, and specifically in 1917, issued what is called the Balfour Declaration, supporting the emergence of a Jewish national home, as they called it, but meaning in effect a Jewish state in Palestine. And they did this partly for altruistic reasons, because Jews had been persecuted so frequently in the Christian world. The British, if some of them may have felt guilty that they were partners to this persecution or oppression over the previous 2,000 years. But they also did it for imperial reasons, apparently thinking that settling Jews in Palestine and establishing some form of Jewish political entity in Palestine, ultimately a state, would benefit British interests because the British would be beholden to the Jews would be beholden to the British for setting up this entity. The Jews would help Britain protect the Suez Canal from the east. This entity would help the British protect the Suez Canal from the east. This was one thing, one element. Another element was that the British felt that by issuing the Balfour Declaration, they would be doing the Jews a big favor, and the Jews who were powerful, they thought, in America and in Moscow, would help persuade the government in Washington and the government in Moscow to support the Allied cause in World War II. World War I. This was the British thinking during the weeks in debating the issue of the Balfour Declaration in November 1917. They were probably wrong in these thoughts that this would help persuade Moscow to turn or remain inside the coalition during World War I, the anti-German coalition in World War I, and would help persuade the Americans to send their troops more quickly to the Western Front to confront the Germans alongside the British and the French. But nonetheless, the British, when they issued the Balfour Declaration, thought this. For the first 20 years of Zionism, from of British rule of Palestine and Zionism 1917-1937, the British apparently continued to consider the existence and the increase of the Zionist presence in Palestine as beneficial to the British Empire. By 37, 38, they changed their minds and they began to think that this was all a big mistake. Supporting Zionism was antagonizing the Arab world, turning the Arab world against them. They needed the Arab world's at least neutrality, if not support, in the forthcoming war, which was apparent, the World War against Germany and Italy and Japan. They would need Arab neutrality at their backs, in their rear, and maybe even Arab support to beat the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese, and changed policy and turned anti-Zionist, which is why they issued in 1939 the famous white paper of May 1939, which restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine and basically envisioned the emergence of an Arab majority state in Palestine and no Jewish state, which they had supported previously.
If Britain were allowing Jews to go over to Palestine to slowly create a state over the next years for their own benefit, so that the Jews could support them in World War I or whatever it is, but also that they could have control over Suez Canal, not to exploit the people in Palestine, but for those other benefits, and the Jews were willing to do that, at what point would you call it settler colonization, or does it have to only be if it's British people going over?
No, I don't think that's settler colonization. The Jews were coming to Palestine and in some way supporting the British, though not very much, in the 1920s and 30s. But the British didn't understood that they weren't really, the Zionists weren't really their agents, and therefore not the same as British youngsters coming and settling in Palestine and holding the fort for the British Empire. This isn't what was happening. And the British understood this probably pretty quickly, especially after the beginning of the Arab revolt in Palestine in spring 1936. From that point on, the British were seen by the Arabs as antagonists, and the Zionists were seen as a problem by the British because they were supporting the Zionists, and the Arabs, for that reason, were attacking the British troops and officials in Palestine. The British began to understand that this wasn't going to work for them, and therefore, as I say, from 37, 38, they changed policy 180 degrees. They simply reversed policy.
What do you think when you hear original Zionist leaders calling it colonization? So, for example, Zev Jabotinsky, not sure if I pronounced it right. I'm sure you know what I'm about to say, but I'll say it anyway. So he's a leader of revisionist Zionism, a very early leader of Zionism. He said in his 1923 essay, The Iron Wall, every native population in the world resists colonialists. That is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing.
Yeah, no, Jabotinsky understood what was happening and how the Arabs would view it. But the word colonization, there's a problem here in terms of the Hebrew. The Zionist leaders were thinking in Palestine, were thinking in Hebrew terminology. And the Hebrew terminology for a settlement, a village with 100 families, 200 families, is called a moshav or moshava. Initially moshava, later moshav. That translates into the word colony. In other words, each settlement was a colony in Hebrew, and that's how in English also people use that term. So the fact that they were settling in these colonies didn't make them colonialists in terms of empires and the establishment or disestablishment of states. It was to do with actual settlement in a place. The word moshav, incidentally, or moshava, comes from the word to settle somewhere in Hebrew. It doesn't mean a colony in the sense of Virginia or Massachusetts as British colonies in America in the 17th, 18th centuries. That's in terms of the Hebrew. So the word colonization, when they translated their usage of Hebrew into English, they kept using the word colonization. All they meant was settling people in villages around Palestine. It didn't mean exploiting or taking over the local population as settler colonialist societies, British agents did, as I say, in America or French in Algeria or Belgians, wherever it was in the Congo.
Okay, so I want to go on to the next point, which is, I guess it's really indisputable that even before Israel was founded in 1948, but even from 1917, the Arabs, or the Palestinians, however you want to call them, they rejected peace options to get to peace again and again and again. So they rejected the Balfour Declaration in 1917. They rejected as not enough Britain's offer, a peace offering of Transjordan, 70% of Palestine for the Arabs. And they rejected it, saying no, they want 100% of Palestine. They rejected the Peel Commission in 1936. They rejected, like you said just before, the 1939 White Paper, which was very much in favour of them. They rejected the UN Partition Plan in 1947, and more and more. But from looking at it from their perspective, where they saw their land as entirely theirs, and they're not willing to give up any land for people who came in to invade their land, does it make sense for them to have that perspective?
It does. The Arabs saw these Europeans who didn't know Arabic, who weren't Muslims. They were Jews, infidels, in fact, in their eyes. They saw them as invaders, European invaders. They couldn't care whether they were really agents acting explicitly, deliberately as agents of an empire or not. They saw them as European invaders. And from 1917-18, they also understood the British supported them. So it was natural that they would see it that way. They believed that the land, the Arabs of Palestine, and the Arabs, in fact, in the societies around Palestine, believed Palestine was an Arab land. It had been conquered by the Arabs in the 7th century. It wasn't naturally Arab. People before the 7th century in Palestine did not speak Arabic, and they weren't Arabs. They were something else. They were pagans, they were Christians, they were Jews. They were not Arabs. But from the 7th century on, after they conquered the country, the Muslims, they began to relate to the country as sacred Muslim territory and as an Arab land, even after the Crusaders had been there for a century or so. But nonetheless, this was an Arab land. The Arabs reconquered it from the Crusaders, and thenceforward it was always under Muslim rule until the British took over in 1917. So it was natural that they would regard the land as Arab and Muslim, and that the Jews as interlopers who didn't belong there, and as I say, as infidels, and see them also as agents of a foreign power. And this is how Arabs were brought up in their education system, in their homes, from 1917, in fact, until the present day. They see the Zionists as robbers and interlopers and Europeans who've come here, even though many of the Israelis today aren't Europeans. They're about 50% or 40% at least descendants of Jews from Arab lands. But they basically see Israel as a stronghold or outpost of Europe in the Middle East, which shouldn't be there. The Middle East belongs to the Arabs and to the Muslims. That's how they see it. And
are they wrong for seeing it like that?
It's not a matter of right or wrong. It's a matter of how they're brought up. We Jews see the land as something which used to belong to us and believe it is our right, to establish a Jewish state there. But the Arabs say this is at their expense and this is all unnatural. It is Arab and Muslim land. In 1917, when the British issued the Balfour Declaration, they more or less referred to the Arabs, not more or less, they explicitly referred to the Arabs living in Palestine as non-Jews. In other words, people who were not Jews, and the declaration offered the Jews some form of political trajectory towards statehood, as they called it, a national home, whereas it didn't offer the Arabs living in Palestine, who were then the great majority of inhabitants of Palestine, any political trajectory for independence. At the time, the Arab nationalist movements were gaining power, and the Arabs of Palestine were touched by this spirit in the neighboring Arab states and began to think also, certainly from 1920 on, in terms of independence and removal of imperial control. And they saw the Zionists as an enemy. So when the British Peel Commission arrived in 1936 and in 1937 issued its proposal for a two-state solution, the Arabs said, why should we agree to a two-state solution? We're still the majority of the population in the country. The Jews are interlopers and robbers supported by an imperial power. We want them all out. We want the British out and we want the Zionists out. This is our land. And so they said the same in 1947. From an objective perspective, the Arabs made a mistake because they weren't on the winning side. They they weren't able to beat the Zionists, and they certainly weren't able to confront and beat the British. So they kept banking on rebellion and warfare, which they couldn't win. And from an objective perspective, perhaps they should have conceded and said, oh, okay, let's compromise and agree to some form of partition of the land between the Jews and the Arabs. But they never agreed to that.
So, I mean, from their perspective, they'd say, well, it's not about about being on the winning side. It's about being right or wrong, which I guess leads on to the next question. Like, who technically has rights to the land? Is it the Arabs, Jews, or both?
Both. The simple answer is both. The Arabs who were living there and for many generations had been living there, as I say, since the 7th century. They weren't all newcomers, as some Zionist propagandists made out in recent years. They were living there, and they were the population of the land, and the Jews were a very small minority. And then came Zionism, and the Jewish numbers grew. But from their perspective, it was theirs, and they were right in believing that. They could have been a little generous and a little, altruistic and thought in terms of Jewish suffering in the world and anti-Semitism, of which the Arabs also were part. They could have thought in those terms as well, but nations don't often do that. They don't usually feel generous towards their neighbors, especially when it comes to land. So the Arabs didn't do that, and the Jews, from their perspective, persecuted everywhere around the world, culminating in a Holocaust, said we must have this land, or at least a large part of it, for a homeland and a haven for the Jews. And the Jews were right also. Both sides were right.
Are the Jews based their right also not just off the persecution, but to this specific land because they lived there 2,000 years ago?
Yes. It's to do both with persecution and unlivability, an inability to live somewhere else in safety, and on the positive side, on the fact that the land for over 1,000 years, between 1200 BC and the 2nd century AD, was populated by Jews, and in part of this time also ruled by Jews. This was the Jews' land. Incidentally, the Arab mayor of Jerusalem, one of the Khalidi family, at some point wrote a letter to Herzl. We're talking about 1897 perhaps. He wrote to Herzl and said, yes, we know. This Khalidi wrote, one of the Arab notables and nationalists, if you like, at the time, wrote to Herzl, yes, we understand this is the Jews' land. That's what he called it. But at the moment, it's full of Arab inhabitants, not Jews. And if you come and try and take it, it will mean bloodshed. And therefore, you mustn't do that. But there was a recognition at that time in the 19th century that this was traditionally the Jews' land. This is how it was seen also in the Quran, and certainly in the Old Testament and the New Testament. This is where the Jews lived, and as I say, had lived and ruled. That after the start of Arab nationalism and Arab violence, antagonism towards the Zionist enterprise, the Arabs began to forget that this was, in their view, the Jews' land. They annulled this. They erased this from their textbooks and from their propaganda. And as Arafat said when discussing the country in the Camp David talks in July 2000, Arafat, the head of the PLO, the Palestine National Authority, or the Palestinian National Movement, in fact, he said to President Clinton, over dinner, this isn't the Jews' land. There was no temple here. In other words, the Jews were never here. This is all a legend, denying the facts of archaeology and history because in favor of Arab nationalism.
So I guess my question is, if Jews have any right to the land because they lived there 2,000 years ago, well, they kicked out 2,000 years ago, and they lived, like you said, for over 1,000 years there beforehand. Does that mean that they don't just have a right to Israel, where they live in now, but to all of ancient Israel, all of Canaan, where they lived, which includes Israel, the Palestinian territory, southwestern Syria, Jordan, parts of western Jordan, Lebanon, which is what Israel used to be. So if they have any rights to Israel, shouldn't it be for all of it?
I don't know. Look, firstly, nobody knows the exact boundaries of ancient Israel, and it changed all the time. There was the original conquest by Joshua, and there were the judges, and then there were the kings, and then there was a division of the land into two Jewish kingdoms, Israel and Judea, and then it expanded and contracted, and one of them fell, and then the second one fell, and then it was reborn. The boundaries continuously changed. What is true is that when the Paris Peace Conference convened in 1918, 1919, at the end of World War I, the Zionist representatives came with a map to the victors of World War I and said, this is what we want. And the map did include all of Palestine from the river to the sea. And as you say, part of southern Lebanon up to at least the Litani River, and a little bit of southwestern Syria, and a part of Jordan, the western edge of the kingdom, what is today the Kingdom of Jordan, as well as, of course, Palestine itself. And this was in line in some way with how they saw the boundaries etched during the Israelite and Judean kingdoms 2,500 years ago. And the victors in World War I didn't accept this map, and didn't, in fact, at that moment, endorse the establishment of a Jewish state. Though, as I said, the British had issued the Balfour Declaration, in some way pointing the way to a Jewish state, but included the phrase in the Balfour Declaration, a Jewish national home should arrive in Palestine, not turn all of Palestine into a Jewish national home. And the British understood this distinction very clearly, and so did the Zionists. The British were saying, you can have part of Palestine, not all of Palestine. So the world community, the international community, rejected the idea of an expanded Jewish state, a greater Israel, if you like, post-World War I.
Okay, so also, talking about Theodor Herzl before, I mean, how important was it that the World Zionist Organization, when they said they wanted to create a Jewish state, that they focused specifically on Palestine, not Uganda or any other places, that they focused specifically on Palestine? Would a Jewish state have succeeded anywhere else, or the only long-term success would have been in Palestine, where Jews have a connection to?
I think Herzl understood. Herzl in the beginning actually was ambivalent. He thought maybe the Jews should settle in Argentina, for example, on the Pampas. Maybe there weren't a lot of natives there, and there were large areas which could just be settled by Jewish immigrants from Europe. And he also looked at Palestine, but eventually him and the Zionist movement understood the Jews would not go anywhere but to Palestine if they want to reestablish a Jewish state. They wouldn't go to the Pampas, and they wouldn't go to Uganda or Tanganyika, or wherever that was supposed to be. It's not that clear. They wouldn't go anywhere else. They wouldn't come in droves and settle there if that was what was on offer. Palestine, on the other hand, had this historic religious attraction to Jews and would draw at least some numbers, and as it proved, sufficient numbers to establish a Jewish state there. And that's why it ended up in Palestine.
Could it have succeeded anywhere else, or you don't think there would have been a big enough movement? Okay.
Probably not, unless the United States had agreed to give one of the states or established a territory and turned it into a state for the Jews. But the United States never really contemplated that. They may have given Utah or whatever it is to Mormons, but it wasn't going to give the Jews a large chunk of the North American continent, and it wasn't realistic. Elsewhere, it was even less realistic. I assume that the end of a Jewish state in Uganda or East Africa would have been quite violent and unpleasant. This doesn't mean necessarily, of course, that the Jewish state where it is today is going to last forever. Nothing, incidentally, lasts forever. Neither did the Roman Empire.
Okay, so I want to move on to 1948. So we've got a big jump here. Are you able to give like a brief overview? I know it's asking for a lot, but like a brief overview.
No, it's going to take hours and hours.
Okay, so I'll just quickly summarize, and you tell me if I've got this wrong then.
Okay,
after the UN partition passed in November of 1947, the Arabs in Palestine launched a civil war, sort of. They started protests, and then it became into a civil war, especially once the Zionist paramilitary groups Irgun and Lehi responded. Then a few months later, around 6 months later, in May of 1948, Israel declared independence. The Arab states then came into Israel. They attacked Israel, and over time Israel won. And during that whole time period was the exodus of 750,000 Palestinians. Is that like a short, okay overview?
One or two small corrections. Firstly, I think the true number is probably closer to 700,000 Arabs who were uprooted from their homes in the course of the war from the territory which ended up being the state of Israel. The second thing is, didn't the Arab response against the passage of the United Nations partition resolution on the 29th of November 1947 wasn't protests. It was initially, from the very start, killing Jews. They started shooting. And that's how the Civil War That's how the Civil War began. It didn't begin with protests. They protested before the passage of the resolution. Once it passed, the Arabs of Palestine moved over to shooting. That's how the Civil War began and snowballed into a full-scale civil war between the Arab and Jewish communities in Palestine, while the British were nominally the sovereigns of the land until they left in mid-May 1948. Secondly, the Arab states invaded Palestine, some of the Arab neighbors, not Lebanon. Everybody always includes Lebanon, it didn't. But the other Arab states invaded Palestine, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq invaded the area of Palestine. And three of them, at least, the Iraqis, the Syrians, and the Egyptians, also invaded the area designated by the United Nations partition plan for Jewish statehood. So they invaded Israel. The day after Israel was established, declared to be established, which was the 14th of May, they invaded on the 15th. The Arab state of Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan, didn't actually attack the Jewish state. So people often say they were also among those who assaulted the Jewish state on the 15th of May alongside their Arab brothers. They didn't. They simply tried to occupy the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Jerusalem itself wasn't part of the Jewish state. The Jews lived in the western half of the city. Arabs lived in the eastern half of the city. The whole of the city was supposed to be basically a United Nations territory, trusteeship territory, not part of the Jewish or Arab states envisioned in the partition resolution. The Jordanians invaded and occupied the West Bank and eventually East Jerusalem as well. And in doing so, they ended up fighting the Israelis as well in and around Jerusalem. But the Jordanians did not attack the Jewish state. It was the other Arab states which did. That's just several points of clarification.
Sure, no, amazing. So I just want to focus specifically on the exodus of the 750,000 Palestinians.
700,000.
700,000, sorry, yeah, I'll get that right now. 700,000. Now, I know it's a very complex question to ask, but who would you mainly assign the blame to for that?
Everybody, the blame can be shared by everyone usefully. Had the Arabs not launched the hostilities in November 1947, and had the Arab states not invaded Palestine, Israel in mid-1948, there wouldn't have been a refugee problem. No war, no refugee problem. So that in that sense, it's the Arabs of Palestine who started the war, and the Arab states who invaded, who continued the war, their responsibility for the creation of the refugee problem. The Arabs would respond to that quite justly. It was the Jewish attacks on Arab villages, on Arab militias, on Arab traffic in Palestine during the Civil War, and the counterattacks against the invading Arab armies from June 1948 onwards, in which Arab villagers and townspeople fled or were even expelled, that the Jews were responsible for the emergence of a Palestine refugee problem. Both things are true. And therefore the responsibility should be shared. Let me add, though, one thing which is commonly not referred to in descriptions of the war. The war also created two additional refugee problems, apart from the Palestine Arab refugee problem, which is with us today, with 6 million Arabs today registered on United Nations rolls as Palestinian refugees. Those two refugee problems were 70,000 Jews were uprooted from their homes in the course of the 48 war, and creating a Israeli refugee problem in the middle of 1948, in the middle of the war. Now, the number 70,000, of course, is much smaller than 700,000, but it's still quite large compared to the population, the Jewish population of Palestine in 1948, which was about 650, 700,000. In other words, 10% of the Jews living in Palestine were uprooted from their homes and became refugees in the course of the 48 war. If, say, 10% of Americans were at war and were turned into refugees, today 35 million Americans would be refugees. So 70,000 Jews turning into refugees in Palestine in 1948 was a serious refugee problem. But most of these, almost all of these, were returned to their homes at the end of the war after Israel won the war and reconquered the villages which they had been forced out of or had abandoned or been kicked out of. That refugee problem vanished by the end of the signing of the Israeli-Arab armistice agreements in the course of the first half of 1949. The second or the third refugee problem created by the 48 war was that of the Jewish communities from Arab lands. There were large Jewish communities living in Arab lands, more or less from long before Arabs existed in these areas. From, say, 2500 BC, there was a community of Jews living in Iraq, in the area which became eventually Iraq. But there were large Jewish communities in the Arab lands in the 20th century, hundreds of thousands in Morocco, tens of thousands in Egypt, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, so on. All these communities vanished as a result of the 48 war. They were either kicked out by the Arab states, intimidated into flight by the Arab governments or by the societies amid whom they lived. And most of them fled in 1948, 49, 50. They fled these countries. And some, as I say, as in Egypt, were actually kicked out by the governments. And most of these refugees arrived in Israel and were resettled in Israel. Hundreds of thousands, maybe as many as 700,000, 800,000 were resettled in Israel and became Israeli citizens. A small number arrived in Egypt, in England, and in France. All of these, the Arab Jewish refugees, and we're talking, as I say, over 800,000 people, ceased to be refugees, and therefore there was no a Jewish Arab refugee problem in the wake of 48, though it was created in the 48 war. But as I say, over the years, they were absorbed and became citizens of other countries, principally Israel. So the war created three refugee problems. Two of them were solved, the Israeli refugee problem and the Arab Jewish refugee problem. But the third problem, the Palestine Arab refugees, continued and in fact burgeoned in the course of the decades since 1948.
Why wasn't it solved? Could the Palestinians, all those 700,000 Arabs, could they have just started their new lives in their new Palestinian territories and created a state? And could they have just, why didn't other Arab states accept them?
Look, theoretically, they could have turned into citizens of a Palestinian Arab state had it arisen in the area of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which had been conquered and were occupied by Jordan and Egypt, respectively. No Palestinian Arab state came into being, but still they could have been resettled and absorbed as citizens by Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan, or by the Kingdom of Egypt, or the Republic of Egypt as it eventually became, or they could have been accepted as citizens in Lebanon and in Syria, where most of them ended up. The fact is that only Jordan gave them citizenship and to a certain degree absorbed them into its economy and into the state structures. But the other states, Lebanon and Syria and Egypt, did not absorb the Palestinians under their control, Palestinian refugees under their control post 1948, and they remained, as in Gaza, very embittered and very impoverished refugees, and exploded periodically into violence against Israel, and in Lebanon against the Lebanese state and the Christians in Lebanon, and in Jordan against the Hashemite kingdom in the 1970s. So this is what happened. They weren't absorbed. For part of the reason for this was that the Palestine Arab refugees wanted to return to their homes and lands. They didn't want to become Jordanians or Syrians or Lebanese. They wanted to be Palestinians living in their state in Palestine, but it never came into being. So they remained refugees partly for that reason. They didn't want to resettle properly in an organized fashion anywhere. The other reason was, another major reason was, that the Arab states wanted them to remain refugees, especially Syria, Egypt, and Lebanon, to use these refugees, miserable refugees, as a tool, propaganda-wise, and eventually also in the form of terrorism against the state of Israel. Here were the people kicked out by Israel and want to return, and Israel won't let them back. and Israel is an evil entity. So there were these two major reasons for the non-absorption of the Palestine Arab refugees in the Arab states. In addition, resettling 700,000 refugees with large birth rates, meaning there would be larger numbers. As I say, there are 6 million Palestinian refugees today, involved enormous expenditure, and nobody was actually willing to lay out the billions and billions of dollars that would be necessary to resettle these people properly in the Arab states or anywhere beyond.
Okay, so also, I mean, you mentioned Jordan there about how they sort of the only Arab country to sort of integrate them. So I want to focus on that. So by the end of the war, like you said, Jordan annexed the West Bank. Now only 2 countries, I believe it was, around the world, or only a very few countries around the world listened to it and agreed to it. And Egypt took Gaza, but they kept it separated. Why did the international world refused to accept the West Bank as Jordan's? Who did they think it belonged to at that time?
Well, the UN UN General Assembly had passed a resolution dividing Palestine into 2 states, and the West Bank was supposed to be the core of the Arab state, which was to have emerged. The Jordanians occupied the territory and didn't allow the emergence of a Palestine Arab state. So in that sense, the world refused to accept the Jordanian occupation and annexation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. It was supposed to be something else altogether, according to the UN General Assembly 1947. And the same applies to the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip was supposed to be part of the Arab state created by the UN partition resolution. The world wouldn't accept its annexation by Egypt. Egypt, I think, didn't formally annex the territory and administered it militarily as a separate zone, but never gave the inhabitants citizenship or even rights to move into or through Egypt. Very few people from the Gaza Strip were actually allowed to leave the Gaza Strip and go to Egypt, say, for studies or to go further beyond outside Egypt. So the place was just a terrible enclave, which later everybody called a concentration camp, a large concentration camp. But if it was a concentration camp, it began with Egypt between the years 1948 and 1967, when it controlled the Gaza Strip.
Why did Egypt do that? Were they trying to keep it for a future state, or did they not really?
Egypt was a poor country. It didn't want to absorb hundreds of thousands. But at the start, there were 250,000 Arabs in the Gaza Strip by 1949, most of them refugees. They didn't want to start paying for absorbing refugees. They did receive international aid, which they siphoned off probably for their own use as well, through the fact that there were refugees there. So that was beneficial to Egypt. Keeping them as refugees, as I say, was a good political weapon against Israel, political and eventually terroristic. They hired terrorists to attack Israel from the Gaza refugee community. But they didn't want to absorb them. Egypt was very poor. It didn't want to absorb large numbers of non-Egyptians, and they always regarded the Arabs of Palestine as non-Egyptian and ultimately as subversive. The Palestinian refugee populations, wherever they ended up, were always in some way subversive. They were miserable. They were homeless. They were stateless. They were never regarded as either proper Egyptians or proper Lebanese or proper Syrians or even proper Jordanians. Nobody really wanted them.
So basically, the West Bank and Gaza, was that almost supposed to be dedicated towards a future Palestinian state?
Yes, and still is. Oh. When the world talks about a 2-state solution to the Israel-Palestine problem, they still envision the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as being the territories on which this state would emerge.
Okay, so that's why when you said before that Israelis going in and settling in the West Bank and Gaza, in Gush Katif or in different places around West Bank, is sort of settler colonization.
Well, it's certainly an obstacle to a 2-state solution. The major obstacle to the emergence of a 2-state solution has always been Arab antagonism, resistance to the existence of a Jewish state in any part of Palestine. That's always been the major stumbling block to reaching an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. But the second major stumbling block has been the introduction by Israel of a large settlement enterprise, especially in the West Bank, which means that the Arabs in the West Bank, should they ever try to become the core of a Palestine Arab state, would have to face a situation in which there were hundreds of thousands, today between 500 and 700,000 Israeli settlers. They would face these settlers who were sitting on much of the land of the West Bank and in some ways controlling large parts of it. How do you establish a Palestine Arab state with this a large settler community of Jews in its midst?
Okay, so I want to look at a different part of the 1948, which is mainly focused, just to ask a question on Ergun and Lehi. Would you call them war criminals, or like the people who did?
Well,
Yeah.
they're not war criminals, but they did probably commit war crimes in the
War
course
crimes.
of their terrorist attacks on the Palestinian Arabs, but also incidentally on the British in their rebellion against the British during the years 1937, 1948. These two dissident organizations, as the mainstream Zionists called them, were terroristic. They killed innocent civilians, if there is such a thing as innocent civilians, incidentally, but they killed civilians deliberately in their terrorist attacks in marketplaces and buses and so on. So they were there, and a problem both for the mainstream Zionist community and for the Arabs whom they were attacking in the course of the 48 war, but also in the years before.
So if they did all those different things, is it concerning at all that the leader of Ergun and the commander of Lehi later became prime ministers? I know it's much later on and it's a different time era, a different time period, but is it concerning at all that these things, which might have been just more of extremist things to do, became mainstream, could have become much more mainstream?
Well, in some ways it's concerning, but in some way it's natural. National liberation movements, organizations, often their leaders eventually become prime ministers of the states which emerge. This occurred in South Africa in some way. This occurred in Kenya, where the leaders of the movements described by the imperial conquerors as terrorists eventually become, suited leaders who sound like normal people. And this is true about Israel. Begin from a terrorist leader in 1948, and he didn't regard himself as a terrorist. He regarded himself as a resistor of imperialism when he fought against the British. He became a prime minister by the 1977 elections, and was well-mannered and civil and various other things, a leader. And the same happened to Shamir, who was one of the heads of the Lehi, became prime minister as a successor to Begin. They were hardliners. They wanted to occupy and continue to occupy, to annex the West Bank. But this aside, they were normal leaders.
Going all the way forward to today, would you say Prime Minister Netanyahu is some sort of follower of those sort of perspectives, or was he even more extreme than them?
I don't know about more extreme. He's corrupt. That's the core, the essence of Netanyahu. And he's in some ways pragmatic more than they were. They were hardline right-wing ideologues. He is a right-winger by nature, but I don't think he's quite as hardline when it comes to his deepest self. But he's totally corrupt, a totally corrupt politician, injecting into the power structure in Israel other corrupt, even criminal elements, including the present head of the Israel police force, the minister in charge of the police, or what's called national security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, was convicted by Israeli courts as a supporter of Jewish terrorism. But this goes all the way down the line. The head of the Israel prison system, the present ambassador of Israel in the United Arab Emirates, who's just been expelled by the United Arab Emirates for acting inappropriately with apparently women in a bar in Abu Dhabi or Dubai. There's a whole list of these people who are half criminal, totally corrupt people who are important in the government run by Netanyahu. And he puts them in these positions of power deliberately because he has this hold over them because they are corrupt, and he can use that against them. But he himself, of course, faces corruption charges in an Israeli court at the moment, constantly postponing the trial, the testimony he has to give, etc., and trying to undermine the Israeli judiciary at the same time as running a war in Gaza, a war in Iran, a war in Lebanon. It's actually quite an act, this juggling act which he runs. It shows a certain amount of ability, a large amount of ability in running a country, while at the same time standing trial on bribery and other charges.
Okay, so you mentioned Gaza. I want to focus on that. Once again, complex question, but would you say what's happening in Gaza is a genocide?
No, I've always opposed this definition. People use that definition in order to compare Israel to Nazi Germany, in order to in some way deflect the whole message and heritage of the Holocaust, which favored Israel's existence and continued existence. You start saying Israelis are committing genocide, you can forget about the Holocaust and focus on Israel's wrongdoing. Genocide is the act of trying to destroy and kill a people, or the actual killing of these people with intention, with deliberation, systematically. None of this has occurred in Gaza or anywhere else by Israel. Israel has not tried to kill or intended to kill the Palestinian people. It may eventually want to expel them, but this is not the same as genocide. Ethnic cleansing, expulsion is not genocide. It's even allowed, incidentally, by the Geneva Conventions, that is the removal of populations in the course of war, with certain limitations, of course. But genocide, which means the intent and the desire and the implementation of killing a people, this is not what is happening in Gaza. Israel has killed lots of civilians. I don't think most of them, or almost all of them, deliberately, but as a side effect of trying to kill Hamas and Islamic Jihad fighters. There have been, I'm sure, war crimes committed by Israeli troops in the Gaza Strip, and only lightly punished, if at all, by the Israeli military judicial authorities. But genocide, a far cry from that.
At what point would you say it is?
Oh, it's not as a matter of point. It's a matter of, is there a policy, desire, intention, policy, and implementation of the killing of the people, the Palestinian people? There has not been, there is no such intention. Some ministers may speak loosely about Amalek or this or that, driving out everybody, demolishing the Gaza Strip, but none of this is policy. The policy has been to demolish the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, while allowing for, accepting the danger of killing a lot of Gazan civilians in so doing. But it's never been the intention to kill Gaza's civilians.
So why do so many genocide experts and historians come out almost like on a daily basis at this point saying it is?
I'm not sure that there's that many genocide experts actually saying that. There are some who've been saying that. I disagree with them. I don't think.
Oh, do you think it's just overblown? It's not
because
that many.
what they do in saying this, they understand there's not been an intention or a policy or actual implementation of a policy of killing the Palestinian people. But what they say is that certain definitions of genocide, and there are a number of definitions, include destroying their cultural artifacts, removing them from certain areas, etc. In other words, things much below killing of a people. And they say, well, this also is accepted as a definition of genocide. I don't accept it as a definition of genocide. I think people understand what genocide is. Common sense tells you what genocide is, and this is not genocide.
So what is Israel's aim in Gaza then? Like, if they're there still, I know that you're probably going to criticize it, but what's
the key question. Nobody knows what the aim is except for destroying the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad. This is Israeli policy. Whether it will be accomplished, whether it's possible to do that completely, whether having destroyed much of Hamas's infrastructure, you've actually already done this and you don't have to kill every last Hamasnik in every last underground tunnel. It's not that clear what Israeli intentions are. The government of Netanyahu is at the moment. But it continues to say it wants to destroy these terrorist organizations, and they deserve being destroyed. They should be destroyed because their existence means that there will never be peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Their existence and their actions prevent any possibility of movement towards peace. But what is being done at the moment is unclear, partly because the Palestinians are still holding hostages, which Israel says it also wants released, but cannot actually achieve their release militarily, because going after the people who are holding them would mean killing the hostages as well. And so the Israeli military is very restricted in some of the things it has been trying to do during the past 2 years.
So, has Israel destroyed Hamas as a military and government, or not as a military and government organization in Gaza already?
Not really. It has managed to take apart Hamas's military organization. It's killed most of its commanders and leaders in Gaza. It's disassembled all of its so-called brigades and battalions in the Gaza Strip, or almost all of them. But there remain thousands, perhaps 10,000, perhaps even as many as 20,000, because they've replenished their ranks in the course of these 2 years. They've killed probably most of the veteran Hamas and Islamic Jihad fighters, but thousands remain in the tunnels and can foray from the tunnels and fire RPGs and plant IEDs and kill Israeli soldiers who are occupying large parts of the Gaza Strip today. So whether these organizations are actually completely finished or not, it's unclear, but their fighters are still able to inflict damage, and probably more important, inflict damage on Israel, but more importantly are able, through terror and maybe through acceptance by the Gaza population of control of the Gaza civilian population by intimidation, terrorism. And as I say, much of the civilian population accepts Hamas's leadership and doctrines. And so long as they control in this way the Gaza population, the civilian population, Israel can't be said to have won the war.
But if they're just going in and they're just killing Hamas members, if that's their aim, to kill Hamas members, but like you said, they just replenish, it seems like a loop here, a cycle.
Yes, you're right. It's a loop and cycle, because there's no way of stopping the Hamas, the remainder of Hamas, replenishing their ranks, because all they have to do is offer $200 or a couple of sacks of flour or something to a 17 or 18-year-old youngster, and there's still hundreds of thousands of Gazan youngsters waiting to join the ranks of Hamas to kill Israelis, because the urge for revenge against Israel must be enormous among all Arabs in the Gaza Strip. So they can replenish the ranks, and there'll still be tens of thousands in the tunnels, in the public spaces, hiding behind civilians and among civilians who will control the civilian population and shoot at Israelis. So I don't really know how you get out of this.
And what
if
do
you
you
ask
think?
me, if you ask me for a solution to the Gaza problem today, I have none.
So, well, don't worry, I won't ask you about that. But I want to ask you. So, what do you think of as well when you hear Ben Gvir and Smotrich say statements? And I'll read out some of them, and you probably heard them already before. So, Smotrich said there are 2 million Nazis in the West Bank. There are no half measures, total annihilation. Ben Gvir said, when we say Hamas should be destroyed, it also means that those who sing, those who support, those who give out candy, they're all terrorists. They should all be destroyed. When you hear that, and knowing they are part of the government, knowing that if they both leave the government, they will topple the government. So they're not just in any, they're just not, they have a lot of power. They're not, of course, not on a day-to-day power. They do have a lot of power on a big decision. And if you don't follow what we say, then we're leaving the government and it all collapses. When you hear those statements, and then when you hear as well that when you said just now that Israel's in Gaza, they're killing people, but it's just replenishing. How do you put all of that together?
I don't know how you put it together. Look, Netanyahu put together this stupid, incompetent, vile government coalition. He could have opted for a different coalition. He preferred to have these people, Smotrich and Ben Gvir, in positions of power and able to topple the government when the government or Netanyahu objects to things they demand. And he's the one who's responsible for this situation, which people, as I say, Smotrich, who barely served in the Israeli army, probably never did. People say he was on some desk job for 2 months or something. And Ben-Gvir, who never served in the army because the army didn't want him because he had been convicted by Israeli courts repeatedly of helping Jewish terrorists kill Arabs, at least inciting them to do so. These people shouldn't be in government, and they are in government by virtue of the will of Benjamin Netanyahu. And he put together this cabinet and is facing the consequences in various ways.
You mentioned before that whenever Hamas need new fighters, it's so easy to get them on board. There's so many people waiting to line up. I want to ask more of an interesting question. If you were in their position right now, you're born into the Palestinian territories in Gaza, and you were raised through all of this, where you have Hamas controlling this dictatorship, sort of Islamic, like you said, organization, plus you have what Israel is doing to you as well. Would you be in the mindset of, okay, I also want to join Hamas?
I probably would. Look, I'll quote Ehud Barak, Israeli prime minister, and probably the most decorated Israeli soldier ever. He used to be the chief of general staff, used to be prime minister. He himself said in one interview, later people criticized him for it, if I were one of the Arabs, I would join the Fatah as well. I would join a resistance movement. I don't think I would ever join something like the Hamas because I'm not a religious person. I'm not a believer, certainly not a religious fanatic like they are. But certainly I would feel the urge to resist the Israeli invader and killer of my family.
How can Israel do anything to change that?
I don't know. As you say, that demands a solution, a political solution, and I don't know if we're going to get there, certainly not with the Israeli government of the day.
And I presume you think the best choice would be to get in someone, a Democrat like Yair Golan is the best sort of like pathway to get there.
He would certainly... Golan, who was deputy chief of the general staff of the Israeli army, would definitely be a much better prime minister than Benjamin Netanyahu. But I can think of another 5 million Israelis who would be better prime ministers than Netanyahu, who was proved extremely incompetent, both because of his responsibility for the 7th of October and for mismanaging this war over 2 years, except the sectors dealing with the Hezbollah and Iran, which were done well. But this was, of course, the Israeli army and air force, not Benjamin Netanyahu.
In the past few weeks, so many countries have been coming out saying, or in the past few days almost, saying, we're going to recognize a Palestinian state. Does it make a difference to Israel? Are they facing their biggest diplomatic threat, or does it not make a difference as long as America is on their side?
It's both a diplomatic threat and a problem and nothing. It's symbolic. These are symbolic gestures. A Palestinian state is not going to come into existence anytime soon with these declarations or without declarations. But there is an undermining of Israel's position on the world stage and among the public in the West by what is going on, the killing of babies, the starvation in certain pockets, probably in the Gaza Strip, certainly the lack of food in many areas of the Gaza Strip. All of this is undermining Israel's position in the public in the West and among governments, because the governments are, of course, democratic governments who have to in some way respond to the will of the public. And that will is demonstrated on the streets of London and Paris and Dublin quite often. So it's a problem.
Thank you so much for coming on, Benny.
My pleasure. My pleasure.